So good evening. My name is Patrick Lewis, and I'm the director of UBC Botanical Garden. I'm delighted to be your host, along with Dr. Megan Aronson, the Dean of Faculty of Science, who will be introducing the evening's speaker. Those of us gathered here acknowledge that we meet today on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We also recognize the many places we live, work, and play, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. By acknowledging the Indigenous stewards of these lands, we're reminding ourselves that Canada's legacy of colonization continues into the present, and that all of us have an obligation to advance reconciliation and decolonization in this country. While I never had the pleasure of meeting Peter Wharton, over the past 14 years as director of the garden, I've seen the value of his legacy in the plant collections we steward and the scientific partnerships the garden maintains. I'm now pleased to introduce this evening's moderator, Douglas Justice, Associate Director of Horticulture and Collections at the garden. Douglas worked closely with Peter for 8 years and will share a few words on his life and his work. Douglas?
Thank you, Patrick. It's really fantastic to see so many people out tonight, and I'm really happy that I can be here. But first things first, can you silence your phones, please? Peter Wharton was a much admired curator of the David C. Lamb Asian Garden. In his long and productive 30 years with the garden, he was instrumental in developing this internationally recognized collection of plants from China, Japan, Korea, and other parts of Asia. In honor of his contribution to horticulture and his lifelong concern for the environment, and in consultation with his family, the Peter Wharton Memorial Fund was established in 2008 to support lectures on plant conservation and biodiversity. We are so pleased that 2 of Peter's family members are joining us here this evening, Sarah and their son, Ben Wharton. Over the years, Peter collected much seed in the wild, and this he distributed to many gardens across North America, Britain, and Europe. These donations were often reciprocated by other collectors, with the Asian garden always the beneficiary. Peter was a strong advocate for using the UBC Botanical Gardens collections to promote conservation, and his expeditions were always collaborative ventures. We would like to thank the many donors who have supported the Peter Wharton Memorial Fund, and thus the Wharton Lectures over the years. These events could not happen without donor support. Some of these supporters are here this evening, and we thank them for their ongoing commitment to Peter's legacy. And thank you to all members, friends of the garden, and donors who support the garden projects and programming in areas such as community outreach, horticulture training, and the Sustainable Communities Field School program. We thank you for your attendance here this evening and for supporting the garden in its mission to bring awareness to the important role of plants and biodiversity in our lives. I'm now pleased to invite Dean Megan Aronson to introduce our keynote speaker this evening.
I'm seeing that I might have brought my glasses. Anyway, let's see. Thank you both Patrick and Douglas for inviting me to join you this evening. And on behalf of the students, the faculty and staff of the Faculty of Science, welcome to this special gathering. It's my pleasure to be with you to celebrate Peter Wharton's legacy of conservation and international collaboration with the UBC Botanical Gardens. And as we've just heard, he was a visionary and established early networks that helped position the garden in international plant conservation. Today, the Faculty of Science continues to work both locally and globally on challenges posed by our diminishing biodiversity, climate change, and a myriad of other conservation issues. To help address these, we are pleased to collaborate with our colleagues in other faculties and other universities so that we can learn more about the world in which we live and assist with finding solutions to some of our most pressing problems. To this end, I'm extraordinarily pleased to be able to introduce to you today Dr. Suzanne Simard, who is a professor of forest ecology in the Forest and Conservation Sciences program in the UBC Faculty of Forestry. Suzanne has pioneered novel concepts about how trees interact and communicate using below-ground fungal networks, and in doing so, she has recognized that large trees that are called mother trees play an important role in the flow of information and resources between trees. So you may already be aware of Suzanne's groundbreaking research through her New York Times best-selling book, Finding the Mother Tree, and that has captured the minds of people from around the world. She has helped to raise our awareness of life below the ground and its complex role in supporting the forest ecosystems. And so without further ado, we are so pleased to invite Suzanne to share her story.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey with me in how I've done my research in the past, but mostly what I'm doing now. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the group of people I'm working with. So I have a team called the Mother Tree Network. It's a new team. It includes my family, my community, my colleagues, and anybody who wants to join. And we have combined forces with Hereditary Chief Randy Cook, who is this fellow right here. And we're standing here with his foundation of artists and scientists called Awinyakola. Awinyakola means that the sea and the land and the forest is all connected together. And Randy, we're standing here at Was Lake, which is in the middle of his territory. He's in the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation, but his tribe is called the Mamtagila. And the Mamtagila tribe is actually not a recognized tribe or nation by the federal government. And so he is very active in trying to restore rights and title to his territory, of his people to his territory. He lives and grew up in Alert Bay, along with most of his family members, and most of his family members have actually never been on their territory because they've been put in a reserve at Alert Bay. And so the reason that we got together was to try to do science and art together, to try to engage people into this overall issue, and to work together to try to restore people on the land. And his idea is that when people are on the land and healing the land, that people will heal themselves and heal their cultures. That's the whole premise. So this group here includes many Kwakwaka'wakw people in the Mamtagila tribe and the Namgis tribe, as well as the Mother Tree students who have worked with us for many, many years. And with this group who've worked together so hard is the overall Mother Tree Network. The Mother Tree Network is kind of a brand new emergent group of, many of us were actually all women, but not solely. So, men are also part of this too. But it just happens that we're leading the group. And we're a group of geographers, scientists, artists, journalists, foresters, policy experts, and so on. And this person right here is actually my best friend, Jean Roach, who is here in the audience. And she's sitting here actually with my family, who are also here, who have also all been integrated or worked variously with me over the years. So these two groups, Awinyakola and the Mother Tree Network, we're working together so that we can convince us, ourselves, our government, our policymakers, the industry, NGOs, to protect, restore forests, and in so doing, convert our economy, our how we see the world, to conserving these beautiful places that give us life, away from extracting and exploiting these beautiful places that give us life. And we're working really hard to transforming our economy from a timber-based economy to a well-being economy. And that well-being economy is complex, but in the transitional part, it will be, what we're envisioning is that we'll transition from earning our income, from cutting down trees, to saving trees so that they can continue to be homes for biodiversity, sequestering and storing carbon, and providing water and clean air for us. Does that sound like a good idea? Yeah. Thank you. So I'm going to tell that story and how I think we can get there. But I'm going to continue on and say that this is a work that's been in progress for decades. And I've worked with many, many students over the years, and so I want to acknowledge the contributions of the students, literally dozens of students, graduate students, postdocs who have contributed to this work. And we're working in collaboration with not just Awinyakola and Kwakwaka'wakw Nation, but other nations too. And many collaborators on the Mother Tree Project. This doesn't actually include them all, but I want to acknowledge one, that we're working with the Sinixt Nation, the Tunaha Nation, the Shepwimek Nation, within which is the Cooks Ferry Indian Band, Soda Creek Indian Band, Williams Lake Indian Band, the Carrier Sekine, as well as nations along the coast, which include Tsimshian, Haida, Heiltsuk, Kwakiwa, and Nuu-Chah-Nulth. Okay, so let's talk about the science a little bit, if I can. So here we are. We're in these incredible forests. We're sitting in them right now, what I'm calling the Pacific Rim forests. And you'll recognize this place. Where is this place? Tofino? Yeah, this is Tofino, Clayoquot Sound. This is really the beginning, the first protests around logging, at least in the NGO world, combining with the Nuu-Chah-Nulth Nation to protest logging that was planned for this area back in the late 1980s and 1990s. These forests, these Pacific Rim forests, are some of the richest carbon-rich forests in the world. They're also incredibly biodiverse forests. So the carbon richness of these forests is about equivalent to rainforests in the Amazon. So they're among the wealthiest carbon-rich forests in the world. The distribution of carbon is different between these forests, but they're equally important. So we're really sitting here in what the world knows and considers to be a place to look to for where possibility occurs, where it exists, and how are we looking after these incredible places? How are we looking after these incredible places? We'll look at that. So these Pacific, let's look inside some of these forests. So this is an old-growth cedar, western red cedar forest. This is a forest that's along the Pacific Rim near Tofino, and these trees are western red cedars. So these forests are homes to some of the most at-risk species, species that only occur in places like this, old places, species like the marbled murrelet, like the northern goshawk, all kinds of seabirds that only live in coastal areas. lichens that only occur in old-growth forests, and of course what I study, which is the below-ground world, a whole host of fungi that only exist in old-growth forests, along with fungi that exist in other kinds of forests too. But the point here being that there are so many species that are dependent on old-growth forests. And an old-growth forest is special, not just because it's biodiversity, but its ability to store carbon, its ability to clean water, and it's also its spiritual beauty as well, that we rely on these places to know they exist and that they're wild. Okay, and I want to remind us that these forests here, these special forests, are connected to all the forests around the world. And my talk today is really about those connections, that what we do in our forests here on the West Coast impacts forests in the Amazon, in the Congo, in Indonesia, the great forests of the world, in Siberia, in the Boreal. It's all connected together. What we log here affects weather patterns down in South America, and vice versa. And so I'm interested in connections, and connections occur across scales. So these are these big global connections where, ocean currents and weather patterns and climatic patterns are interrelated. So too is what's going on below ground. And so I became really fascinated with these connections, how things are connected, because when I was a young forester working in the forest industry, I started to realize that what we were doing in forests was actually disconnecting these places. We were disconnecting plants and trees and soils. And so I started to really try to understand, first of all, what do those connections look like? And I looked at a group of fungi in the soil called, what? Mycorrhizas, yes. Mycorrhizas are a special group of fungi. There's about 4 major groups of fungi. There's decomposers, there's pathogens, there's endophytes, and then there's this other group called mycorrhizas. And mycorrhiza literally means fungus root, where a fungus and the root of a plant grow together in a symbiosis, where the plant, in this case a little tree up here, is photosynthesizing, and as it photosynthesizes, it allocates carbon down into its root system, and a good portion of it ends up in this fungal network or symbiont that then grows out into the soil. And the fungi are out there looking for nutrients and water to take up from the soil and bring back to the plant and exchange it for that photosynthate. It's almost like it's a trade. It's a total trade. So almost all plants all over the world have to form these relationships in order to survive, have fitness, reproduce. So it's an obligate symbiosis. And mostly it's a mutualistic one where both benefit. And so obviously in this case, there's a lot of carbon, a lot of photosynthate that gets fixed here and ends up in the soil. In fact, when we use isotope labeling, we find out that at least half of the photosynthate of a plant ends up in the soil and feeding this network. And that is actually borne out in our studies as well, as I'm going to show you a little bit later. So just imagine 50% of the energy that these plants are fixing is ending up in the soil. This whole world that's underneath our feet that we hardly know anything about. So I was interested in those, and when I was thinking about connection and disconnection as a young forester, I started learning about this study being done in the UK in the laboratory by David Reed, who was looking at whether these fungi, these mycorrhizas, could actually link trees together. And he grew seedlings in root boxes in the lab, and he was so ingenious. He took carbon dioxide that was labeled with carbon-14, and he labeled this plant, allowing it to photosynthesize, take up that CO2, and he was able to trace using autoradiography, which is kind of like using a Geiger counter, but using photographic paper. He was able to trace that photosynthate going down into the roots and going through the network right into the roots and up into the shoot of the neighboring plant. That was absolutely groundbreaking at the time. He published that in Nature in 1984, and the world didn't pay attention. But it actually created a lot of discussion among academics. They're going, what is this? That can't be right, because individuals don't actually share things. They compete for things to live. And so there was this huge sort of English discussion back and forth about how these were important. I heard about it, and I thought, I wonder if this happens in our forests up in Canada. Where we're actually, when I was growing up, was just a sea of old-growth forests. I grew up in 1960 at Maple Lake, in the Maple Lake area, Monashee Mountains, surrounded by old-growth forest. My dad and my grandfather and my great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather were all horse loggers in that area. And they were selective loggers. But when I became a forester and I started looking at what was happening, it wasn't that at all. It was about, much more than selective logging. It was about disconnecting these places. And so I asked the question, what are we doing here? What's happening with these connections? Do they exist in our forests, and what happens when we log them? And so I ended up, over many years with all my graduate students, of which there are many, looking at these mycorrhizal connections and trying to figure out what they do and how important are they. I'm sorry, that's a lot of spitting in there. Sorry. And I went into all kinds of forests, but this is the forest where one of my graduate students, Kevin Byler, spent a long time studying. And we were looking at, in this forest that has about 100 species of mycorrhizal fungi in the ground, which we'd already counted in another graduate study beforehand. And we thought, what if we could map one of those species, one of the 100 species? So we picked Rhizopogon, which is the most common species and sister species on Douglas fir. And I picked this forest to do this in because this forest is a highly structured forest. It's an old-growth forest in the interior. It's dry. These trees are about 300 years old, this big one here. And then there's some smaller ones that are about 200, 100, some 80-year-old trees, some 70-year-old, 50-year-old, 30-year-old. I know they're really small for 30, but it's true in there. And all the way down to little seedlings that are like 5 years old. And so this is a forest that's a lot of old growth forests are like this, where you have parents and grandparents and all of their offspring growing up underneath them. In fact, that's often what defines whether you have an old growth primary forest, is whether it's regenerating under its own canopy. So this fit that definition. And I thought, if we understood how these trees are connected with all the different generations growing up under them, we might be able to infer something about their dynamics. So what Kevin did is he used molecular techniques to basically go into a forest. This is a forest that's about 30 meters by 30 meters in this figure on the right. And he uncovered all of the root tips and all the fungal bits that he could get from the forest. So he sampled all around the trees, he sampled between them, and he spent 5 years unraveling the DNA of those fungi and those roots. And he basically determined if two trees, like if this tree here and this tree here had the same individual fungus on their roots, that these two trees would be connected. Okay, so that's the premise of this map then. So what he made is, from this forest, he made this map looking down, and what you see here are all the trees in that forest, from the old trees that are the big dark circles to the youngest trees down here, the seedlings. And he was able to draw or connect where the fungal individuals were linking those trees together. So there's a whole bunch of things coming out of this picture of trees. One is that pretty much all these trees here are connected together by that single fungal species. Now I want you to imagine if we'd been able to map all of the other 99 species, what that might look like. All connected. And the other thing he found out was that these big old trees, these dark circles here, these big old ones, they're the most highly connected. You can see they've got lots of linkages. Look at this one, it's linked to so many other plants, whereas the young ones they're not quite as connected together. But they just don't have as many root tips because they're smaller. So it shows less connection, but really they all are connected together, but the big ones are the ones with connections to everybody around them. So in graph theory, they're called hubs. They're the hubs of a network. And there's all kinds of networks in our world. There's hydrologic networks, there are airport networks, there are transportation networks with hubs, like big airports like the Vancouver airport and small regional airports all around. It's the same kind of map, same kind of network. This is called a scale-free network, and a lot of biological networks have this exact pattern. So the networks in your brain, the neural networks in your brain, they follow the same pattern with highly connected hubs and smaller nodes. Okay, so these big old trees are highly connected. So we thought, well, what are they doing? And we started doing a whole bunch of experiments, and 20 years of experiments, actually. And some students planted trees, little seedlings around these old trees, whether they were connected to the old tree or not. We followed their germination rates, their growth rates, their nutrition. And basically what we found is that, and I'll tell you the story, that when those seeds, imagine you're a seed in a cone on a Douglas fir tree, the cones open up in the fall, the seed falls down, hits the ground, most of those seeds die, 95% or more. They're either eaten by a mouse or eaten by a slug or something, but some of them germinate, a small portion, 5%. And when they germinate, within a month, they link into the network of those old trees. Because those old trees are supporting that vast mycorrhizal network by feeding it carbon through photosynthate, drawing in and feeding that network. So the little seedlings tap into that network and they become colonized by the mycorrhizal fungi within a month of their life. And if they don't, they die, because they have to be connected. They have to have that symbiosis. So in these forests, just following them for a few months, we found that the survival of seeds that we put out there was higher by 60% than if they were not connected. And then following them over their lives, if they remain unconnected, they just die out. So that's cool. That means that those seedlings are actually dependent on tapping into the network to get through the first stages of their life. So now the forest is starting to look a little different, isn't it? It's more like a community. It's actually kind of like a family. So we started doing more and more experiments. So now we know that these trees are, they're encouraging, they're nurturing the young seedlings coming up. And then we asked another question that seemed like the next best question to ask. And what do you think that would be? What question would you ask next about those seedlings? Are they communicating? Well, yes. So that was another question we asked is, how are they actually, so they're tapping into this network, do these old trees actually pass any information onto them? And so we did a whole bunch of lab studies, a whole bunch of greenhouse studies, a whole bunch of field studies, and we found out that these trees are actually sending carbon back and forth between them, from one tree to the next and back again, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, regularly, all the time, within minutes, hours, days. The other thing that they're sending is that if an old tree or a seedling or a nearby tree becomes injured or sick, that they actually send more information. They send information about defense. We don't completely understand how that works, but what we find is that when one tree is sick and its neighbor that's connected to it is connected via its network, that neighbor can detect the health of its donor or its neighbor or its mother tree, and it upregulates its own defense enzymes in order to ward off whatever that sickness might attack it. So there's this communication, right? There's a communication of resources and information. Okay, so what's the next question? What else would I ask about these seedlings? What would you want to know about those seedlings and the parent trees? What's the benefit to the parent? That's a good question. Well, who asked me that question? Yeah, that's a good question. So interestingly enough, well, what do you think the benefit is? What's your hypothesis? Some kind of genetic insurance, yes. So yeah, I mean, we all want our children to do well, right? And survival of the fittest is a very, it's a strong imperative, and that means, looking after the young. So we did, there was a graduate student who went back to this network several years later, and they looked at the old trees and looked at the growth rings and how fast they were growing in the old trees. And it turned out that the more linked they were to the other trees, the number of connections that they had to other trees was correlated with their growth rate. Okay, so the parent trees were also growing faster when they were highly connected. including, of course, and most trees in a forest like this have relation. They have relation. Because most seed falls within 100 meters of a tree. Generally, seeds are heavy, and they fall and they land around those parent trees. Okay, so that's a really good question about the parents. What about the, yes? What happens when you knock up that's a really good question. What happens when you knock out a hub? So we did a bunch of little modeling studies on this, and then we actually went and measured what it would look like in the field. We looked at logged areas and not logged areas, and the network completely reorganizes itself, right? So when you lose the hubs, the big old trees, the network simplifies, and it reorganizes into a simpler network. And then over time, if you let that forest regrow to 100, 200, 300 years, the network reestablishes into this, from a more regular network into this scale-free network, where the hubs are highly connected, which is a much more resilient network because of these big hub trees become, such important keystone parts of the ecosystem. So that's a good one. What's the next question I would ask? Yes, exactly. Our relatives prioritize. Excellent. So what we did is we got the kin recognition plant pioneer, Dr. Susan Dudley, to come and work with my graduate students. And we asked the question, do these trees recognize the relatedness of their neighbors? Can they favor those relatives? And it turns out that they can. So we took full seedlings, grew them up together, and we challenged them with strangers, their siblings, and we looked at how their growth patterns changed depending on the identity of their neighbors. And we found out that siblings improve each other's growth. And when they have a neighborhood that is strange and more complex with other species, that they even favor each other more and more and more. So the stranger the environment, the more that kin recognition occurs. And those kin seedlings have bigger mycorrhizal networks, they have bigger root systems, they actually grow better, and they have better nutrition. And so those kin seedlings are actually able to perform better when they have their related neighbors around them. Now that's a very that's very experimental, and it's very complex, but it's really interesting that plants can recognize their kin. We used to think that was just an animal thing, but now we know it's in plants too. Okay, I'm going to move on. So I want to move on. Okay, the story gets more and more interesting as we go. So I work very closely with Dr. Teresa Ryan. She's Tsimshian, so her nation is in the Prince Rupert area. She's of the Gitland clan, and she's a salmon fishery scientist. And we started working together about 10 years ago. And we asked the question of, do salmon influence mother trees? And do they influence networks? And so we got a couple of graduate students together, and we went into Healtsick territory, and we started studying these things. And Teresa, along the way, taught me so much about her culture and the way of seeing the world. And the way she sees the world as the place is that we're all connected together. That this cultural view of connectedness instead of separateness is celebrated through their potlatch system. And I just want to show you, a little picture of the Kwakwaka'wakw potlatch, where in a potlatch is a ceremony of the resources and how those resources are cared for by the people, especially families of wealth and influence. And in a potlatch, it is a transmission of knowledge and social reproduction through including social institutions like governance and law, and who has rights over land and resources, who has responsibility for those resources. And it's also a place where all kinds of social institutions are carried out, like marriage and birth and rites of passage are celebrated. And one of the things I was going to point out here is that in this dance, and in this particular dance, you can see that the thunderbirds, which are with the big cedar beaks, they're made of cedar trees, and that the dress is made of cedar bark, and the totems or the family poles are made of cedar, and it's a celebration of the life and the connection of the people to the land. And everything is about honoring Mother Earth. And it's not just in the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation, but all the nations in British Columbia, all the nations across Canada, all of the Indigenous people around this earth. The one thing that they have in common is honoring and taking care of Mother Earth. And so I want to tell you a little bit of a story about how that's done. So here we are. This is actually up in Bella Bella, so it's not Kwakwaka'wakw territory, it's Haltzik territory. And Teresa and I, she's a fisheries scientist, remember, and one of our graduate students, Ellen LaRock, went up to 28 rivers around Bella Bella, which had varying salmon populations in those rivers. And we wanted to look from low populations to high populations of salmon, what is the influence on the trees and the soils and all the creatures that live in the soil. And so we went way, way up these inlets, many inlets actually. We went with a guide, Ron, who is he's a Haltzik fisherman, a Haltzik guide. And we went up Roscoe Inlet, actually, as well as other ones. And we came to an old village site called Hawaiiat. And Hawaiiat is an ancient village site that's been being studied quite intensively, but the carbon dating shows that this village site has had inhabitants about 6,000 years ago. And a lot of the villages and along the coast have inhabitants that have been there for at least 6,000 years. Haida probably 14 or 15,000 years of inhabitation. And so in this 6,000-year-old village site, there's many things that we came across. So the first, oops, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. Oh no, this thing is, okay, here we go. So as we come into the inlet at Hawaiiat, we come across this stone wall, and Teresa says, "That's a tidal stone trap." And Ron says, "You're right." And so how does that work? You can see that, as the tide comes in, what happens is that this stone trap was built as a passive salmon fishing technology. So it was built thousands of years ago. And by the way, these tidal stone traps go all the way from Alaska and Tlingit territory all the way down into Washington and Coast Salish territory, all up and down the coast along the inlets. And the way it works is that the tide comes in and the tide goes out. And when the tide goes out in spawning season, the salmon get trapped behind that stone wall. And then the salmon are passively picked off and taken to the shore, and they're dried and prepared for food, and that provides food for the winter for the nation. And one of the amazing things about this technology is in fishing this way, there's a lot of connection between the people and the fish. So there's a lot of observation of what's going on with those fish populations. There's a counting of the fish. And so when the populations go up and down, of course they do that naturally. Every 4 years it's on a cycle. But were able to keep track of how those populations were doing and adjust harvest schedules accordingly. They could also design the harvest to allow the big mother fish and the big father fish go upstream to spawn. And so in doing this, they were actually able to steward the populations of salmon, and the salmon sizes of the fish would go up and up through this careful stewardship over the generations. Okay, so we went over that tidal stone trap, and then we came into the area, into Hawaiiat, and we started seeing these other gardens along here. There's a bunch of clam gardens in here. So that's another technology where the clam beds are prepared for the clams to reproduce. And they're right there in the village so that they're easy to harvest. And so here we have, we've got a tidal stone trap, we've got a clam garden, and as we go in, we start to see other things like what's right here. So, what's right here is actually a root garden. So these are root gardens where there's a bunch of species that have been planted and cared for that provide root crops for food over the winter. And as we go in, we also see, there's a whole bunch of salmon berries here. It's a salmon berry garden. And this salmon berry garden is nurtured with pruning and also bringing in the salmon when the salmon are harvested, and the guts or the offals of the salmon are actually taken to the salmon berry, and they're made as it's fertilizer for the salmon berries that produces bigger salmon berries. And you go into here and you find that there's all kinds of trees that are CMTs, or culturally modified trees that have been stripped for bark. There's plank trees, there's village houses, all kinds of things going on here. It's a whole sustainable village. But we were following the salmon. So we go up this stream and we're following the salmon because we want to see where the salmon are going. We want to see how they get in upstream and whether there's a vector of those salmon into the forest. So we're following along and, oops, Teresa says, I don't think we should go up here. And my grad student and I said, well, let's follow these bear trails. So there's bear trails all through where because what we were trying to figure out is where the bears, when they're fishing for salmon, where do they take them? So we're following these bear trails, and we climb, up onto this bench, and we find this bed underneath these big old trees. And this is a bear bed, and there's enough room here for a mama bear and some cubs. And when we look more closely, we find that there's bones. Oops. There are bones here with mushrooms growing out of them, and there's scales and fins. So it turns out that in following these bears, and other people have done this too, that I'm not having a lot of luck with this. Okay. So what the bears do is when the salmon are spawning, they fish for the bears, or fish for the salmon. They bring them into the forest, they take them up the trails, and they go into the forest where it's nice and safe. They can see everything. There's a big mother tree, and they eat the salmon. And they leave most of the salmon behind. And that salmon then decays, and it seeps into the forest floor, and the roots, the mycorrhizas, pick up that salmon nutrients, and it ends up in the trees. I can't win with this thing. So in the trees then, the trees become more fertilized, they're bigger, and they then shade over the streams. The detritus from the trees ends up in the streams. It feeds the aquatic food web, and that provides more habitat for the salmon. So in essence, what I'm trying to show you here is that the way the Hultzik fished was to care for the salmon. And then the salmon went upstream, and they cared for many things to be sustainable. They went upstream, they were picked up by the bears, which carried them into the forest. The salmon ended up feeding the trees, and then the forest shaded the stream and looked after the salmon, which then look after the people. It's a big cycle of life. It's a cycle of stewardship. Okay, so that idea of stewardship is expressed in language. And this is a word in the Nechonlith, one of the Nechonlith languages, groups of languages, and this word is Hishuk Ishtuwak. And what it means is we are all connected together. In all of the languages in British Columbia, of all the 30 language groups here, there is a word for we're all connected together. We are all one together. So, okay, so now I want to bring us back to the present. Where are we right now? So, I don't know why I'm having such a hard time. This is Vancouver Island. This is what Vancouver Island used to look like. This is a picture of the old-growth rainforest prior to colonialism. It's all old-growth forest. Here's what it looks like today. Oh, sorry. Where am I supposed to point this thing? Over you, okay. Okay. This is Vancouver Island today. So when we look at Vancouver Island now, there's very little old growth left. And there's a technical advisory panel that looked at the state of old growth in British Columbia. And what we have left of the big, tall, treed old growth forests, which I showed you at the beginning, these big old trees, there's only 2 to 3% of them left. Just let that sit with you for a minute. Now, when we look at what we think, what the conservation scientists say is sustainable, What's a sustainable level where we conserve all species? It's around 50%. We have 2 to 3% left. Okay, so I'm not saying this to make us all feel bad. I'm saying this because we have a lot of work to do. Okay, so let's go next. So the impacts are huge. This is in Randy's territory, and we went up last summer and we were looking at some of the same old growth trees falling every day. Every day today, they're still falling down. Those little patches of old growth that you saw are coming down very quickly, and the impact on the nations is huge. And it's not just happening here, it's all over the world. So this pink area is actually where, areas that have been affected by logging in a big way. If you can look, here's Vancouver Island. Sure enough, not much left. Fairy Creek is one of the last standing old growth patches left on Vancouver Island. So worldwide, the impacts are huge, and there are feedback loops. When we cut down these old growth forests, there's feedbacks to climate change. It actually amplifies climate change. And climate change amplifies forest fires, and forest fires amplify more climate change. And the cycle goes. It's a big positive feedback. So we have to do something about this, right, for the future generations. And, a lot of these places that have been logged, we've replaced these old growth forests with forests like this. And these forests are not very healthy. These are plantations. So we've basically decided in our province we're going to cut down all the old growth forests and we're going to replace them with these plantations. And that's what's happening. Okay, and we don't let them grow very long. We let them grow to be maybe 50 or 60 years old. Okay, so, and this, we're seeing that climate change amplification playing out in our province every year now. Fires beget more fires. I won't go into that very much, which beget floods. And when we went back up to Haltsick territory in one of those salmon rivers last summer, there was a big fish die-off in one of those rivers because the temperatures went up, the water was too low, and 52,000 fish died almost overnight. So it's real, it's here, and what I want to show you, though, is that there's some things that we can do about this. And I would like to know how much time I have left. Oh, that's a lot of time. How are you guys doing? Oh. Thank you. I feel like a real klutz up here with this thing, and I have to apologize. And this thing feels really weird too, but okay, we'll keep trudging on here. Okay, so what are we going to do? So we set up a project called the Mother Tree Project, which has grown into the Mother Tree Network, which is looking at ways to fix this problem. Okay, so we're people, we need stuff, we need to live, we need some wood, we need clothing, we need food, we need a good climate, we need to be able to live our lives. So how do we do this without destroying our environment? We got to figure this out. So the Mother Tree Project is one way, one look at how we can do this. So what this project does is it asks the question, how can we still manage forests so that they're resilient and regenerative and storing carbon and housing biodiversity as climate changes? Can we still log, or do we have to pull back completely? And so we looked at all these forests that cross this big climate gradient from hot, dry forests, in the south to cold, wet forests in the north to warm, wet forests on the coast. So it's a big climate gradient. And British Columbia is beautiful for doing this because we have this beautiful mountain ranges with lots of climatic variability. So it's a natural experiment. It's a scientist's dream, really, to do these kind of experiments. And you can just see these different kinds of forests. They're all Douglas fir dominated. And we started asking the question, well, how much carbon is in these forests? And what might it be, where is it? What's it valued at? And I just want to put a backdrop here of, this is a map of carbon in Canada. And you can see, I just want to point one thing out. This is all forest carbon. This is what's above ground, below ground. And you can see that our West Coast forests, the Pacific Rim forests, have got the richest carbon stocks in all of Canada when you add up everything in the carbon pool, just to reinforce that this is a special place. It just so happens that this is also a biodiversity hotspot in the world. They go together. So Canada has 6% of the world's forest carbon. At the same time, this is what's going on in the soil, and you can see the soil carbon. We have actually 20% of the world's soil carbon, according to this study. And you can see again here on the west coast, Haida Gwaii, all the territories I just talked about along the coast, really, really rich in soil carbon. And then the other rich place, of course, is the boreal forest and permafrost areas up here, really rich in carbon too. But the main point here is that these are rich, rich places. And the other point here is it took thousands of years to get that carbon in there. It's through a process of photosynthesis and conversion of that carbon through the soil food web and storing it in the soil in protected areas that are basically organic particles stuck to mineral particles, and those are very, very stable particles. So it's a really important carbon pool that took thousands of years to get there. Okay, I want to show this too, because carbon is becoming, we've got too much in the atmosphere, not enough in our ecosystems intact, and so we've started to put a price on carbon. We started to put a price on a tax on when we put too much CO2 into the atmosphere, it's going to cost. Ultimately, it's polluters should pay for carbon that's being emitted to the atmosphere. We have too much up there. And so Canada, in all of its, its agreements, it's signed on to different agreements. It's the United Nations agreements as well. COP, United. Move on, Suzanne. Okay. Basically said we're going to regulate the price of carbon at a fixed rate, and it's going to keep increasing over time. And this is followed as well in Europe as well, that they're also following a similar pattern, that we're going to say the price of carbon is going to go up and up and up, so that we pay for the price of polluting. Now, it's way messier than this. This is a dream come true. In reality, the price of carbon is much lower than this, but ultimately this is where we need to go. And this will all start to make sense in a minute. But basically, if we're moving carbon from logging or fossil fuels or cement production into the atmosphere, that whoever does that or whoever's producing it needs to pay for that. And when you pay for it, you can regulate it. It actually becomes a kind of like a punitive thing if you're emitting too much. That's what carbon markets do. Okay, so I'm going to come back to where carbon is in our forests. This is actually just a picture of the distribution of carbon in our forests. This is a coastal forest here, and you can see there's 600 tons of carbon per hectare in this forest. This is an interior forest over here in the drier area. There's about 250 tons of carbon per hectare. I know that that's kind of weird to understand, but the main thing here is to show that carbon follows a very strong climatic gradient where the coastal areas are very, very rich in carbon, and so therefore are very important to protect, and it's correlated with biodiversity. The other thing to note here is that half of that carbon is in the soil, in the forest floor, in the roots, and in the mineral soil, and the other half is in the trees and whatever, the understory and the coarse woody debris. In the Amazon, most of the carbon is in the trees would be over 90% is up in the trees, and only about 10% or less is in the soil. And it's just because of the differences in climate and soils. So we have, a lot of our carbon is protected below ground, which is really cool. And we have these gradients. Okay, so in places like Fairy Creek over here, there's actually double the amount of carbon that there are in forests around Vancouver. Okay, so Fairy Creek, instead of 600 tons of carbon per hectare, it's 1,300 tons of carbon per hectare. Okay, so when you're hearing about Fairy Creek and why it's important to protect, this is one reason. It's really important. Okay, so really super rich in carbon. Okay, so we are tracking what happens when you take a forest and you start cutting it in different patterns, taking some trees out. Sorry. In this case, we took out, we selectively logged this forest, kind of like my grandfather would have done. He would have taken fewer trees than this, but this is leaving 60% of the trees behind, 30% of the trees behind, 10% of the trees behind and versus a clear cut, and we tracked what happened to the carbon stocks in those forests. Okay, so here's the above ground carbon pool. So this is just all the part that's above ground. So half is below ground, half is above ground. This is over time, slowly carbon accumulates in these forests because old growth forests in studies around the world show that they slowly keep accumulating carbon, which is different than the old story that these forests are decadent and old, therefore we need to cut them down. Is actually the opposite. They keep accumulating and getting richer and more biodiverse and rich in carbon. What happens when we clear cut those forests? We lose it. So this is clear cut. We immediately lose, above ground, we lose about 90% of the carbon. And it goes off into these different places. 65% of it is emitted to the atmosphere, probably immediately, or at least the models assume that, and then about 35% goes into various longer term products, which on average last about 25 years. Okay, so there's a huge change, and then what we have in our management is that we say, okay, we lose this carbon, then we're gonna cut the forest again. So the plan is to cut maybe in 80 years. So that's an 80-year rotation. So the carbon pools actually don't recover, and we cut again, and we keep cutting, and the carbon pools go down. And so what's happening is, number one, we're losing storage of carbon when we clear cut forests, and we lose the ability of the trees to continue to sequester carbon. Right? So it's kind of a double whammy. Yeah, and these really short rotations that we've put our forests on means that they'd never have a chance to recover even close to what they had before. So they're operating on average, I would say, about 25% of what they should be as an old growth forest. Okay, let's look at the soil. So this is actually soil at Fairy Creek. This is about 1.5 meters deep forest floor. And so we started looking at what happens when you clear cut a forest like this. And we went into Quika territory in Phillips Arm, and we started looking at what's called a chronosequence of clear cuts that are from clear cuts as old as 150 years old to recent ones, and we reconstructed what's called a soil recovery curve or a carbon recovery curve in soil. And we found that, again, we're losing 90% of soil, of that forest floor soil carbon, that forest floor carbon. And it takes, remember that this took 14,000 years to build up. It takes a chainsaw to get it back down, to lose 90% of it. And we never really have a chance, they never have a chance to recover because we go back and we cut it again and again and again. Okay, so this is kind of a sad story. But so I'm gonna go from here to this to convince you or to show you why these kids were out here saying it's worth more standing. I hope that in my long, boring review of this data, it drives home the point that it really is worth more standing. From a carbon point of view and a biodiversity point of view, once these forests are cut, we cannot recover them. Okay. All right, so what do we do? Oops, shoot. Sorry. Okay. Well, these aren't, there's always many solutions to a problem, and I'm going to show you a few things that we're working on with Awinicola and with the Mother Tree Network. So the first thing, which I think that we all know, is that when we look globally at where the carbon stocks are in the world, where the biodiversity is in the world, the highest amounts are in territories that are controlled and managed by Indigenous people. In British Columbia, the same thing is true. And so that is why, the United Nations in the Declaration of Indigenous People said, we need to be working on restoring rights and title. It's not just important for the nations, it's important for all of us. Because that stewardship ability, the ability to steward the salmon, to keep the populations high, is from thousands and thousands of years of knowledge accumulation. the colonial government that we have, 5 more minutes, we don't have that knowledge. But we can work with the nations and to try to, to work with them to help them recover knowledge that's been lost by giving them rights and title, or by returning rights and title to them, and working in a braided knowledge system where scientists and community people and First Nations people like Randy Cook work together with Western science and Indigenous science and find a path forward. So that's the first one, is restoring rights and title to nations and providing local communities. So I live in Nelson. The Sinaiax people lived in Nelson. There's not many Sinaiax people there, but there's a big local community that really wants to do stuff. So working with local communities as well is really important to provide stewardship of their own local forests, because we care about our forests and we can do a good job of looking after them. Right now we've given that right away to big multinational corporations, and they're not doing a good job. We're losing carbon like water through a sieve. So then the second thing is, and I hope I've convinced you that these old growth forests are really important to keep. They're worth more standing for our lives. And when you hear about that, to stand up for that. And it's not just old growth, but primary forests. And primary forests are really just forests that have not been logged before, or at least not industrially logged before. They're important too, because they still contain intact carbon pools in the soil and in the trees. And then the third thing is that when we do harvest, because remember I said we're people and we need stuff, and we still need to live in the forest. We live in a forest. Is when we do forestry, that we go in, we focus our logging efforts in second growth forests, and we use improved forest management. Okay, so I'm going to show you what that means. So in our mother tree project, we've been looking at ways to improve forest management by using these different techniques. And what we found is that when we retain high amounts of trees, almost like continuous cover forestry, and I'll say that, it's like the more trees we leave behind, the more protected our carbon pools are, the more protected biodiversity is. And so, we need to shift away from the standard operating practice, which is to clear cut, and we've all seen a lot of clear cuts across this province, to leaving a lot behind when we do harvest. So basically taking some trees but leaving most of them behind. There are ways to do this to protect carbon pools and biodiversity. And then the second thing is we have a whole landscape of degraded plantations that are operating. They're like an old jalopy, like an old, geezer car that's puffing out gasoline and smoke. That's what they're like. We need to go into them and restore them, so that they're back again being, taking in CO2 and housing biodiversity. And how do you do that? Well, with hands and hearts. It's us. It's us getting out into the forest and doing that, and having, giving the nations the right to go back onto their territory and practice their traditional ways, because that's it's restoring the understory, the medicinal plants, the berry plants, so that they look like this on the right instead of this on the left, which is what the vast majority of our plantations look like now. And so in doing that, you actually start accruing and sequestering more and more carbon. And that carbon is worth, remember that ugly graph I showed you about increasing carbon prices? Well, if we put a price on carbon, we can actually start earning money from growing back vital, restored biodiverse forests again, because the more diverse the forest is, the more carbon is sequestered and stored in the soil and above ground. So it's possible. And so these are all important things. Protecting, rights and title, protecting old growth and primary forests, improved forest management in second growth forests, and restoring our damaged industrial plantations. And to do this, and Bryony Penn writes about this beautifully in her book, is we all need to get into the same canoe, in this magic canoe, and paddle in the same direction, so that we're all thinking about these things and pushing our government to do this. And our government right now is poised to do something right, but they're not quite there yet. They're saying a lot of good things, but they're not quite getting it quite yet. So we have to keep pushing them and holding them to account so that we can recover and save these forests for our future generations. My daughter and her boyfriend, and they're right there. I want them to have a great life, and that's why we need to do this. And I'll leave it with, from Randy Cooks, Hereditary Chief Randy Cooks tells me, he says, if we can heal the land with our hands and our hearts, we can heal the people. So thank you so much.
Oh, good. Thank you, Suzanne. What a terrific presentation. I think we have time for just a couple, maybe 3 questions, if they're not too long. So let me just come right here.
Thank you, Suzanne. I was particularly heartened to see some of your solutions about how we can start to turn this around. However, this morning I read in the CBC News, there's an article, who's behind Canada's new pulp and paper powerhouse? Where's the money coming from? And this giant company called Paper Excellence, with Filipino-based, is gobbling up our forestry companies, and the funding is coming from China. So this is, people can find this on the CBC website, just search forestry, but they're buying up these mills, and they're absolutely demolishing the forests, and they kind of hide behind the forest certification standard, which gives them more money and things like that. But so my point in saying that is that we want to heal these forests that have been damaged, but I think we also need to push really hard to stop this very, very wrong devastation, apart from the fact that we're sending pellets to Britain and making Charmin toilet paper out of forests. It's just so wrong. So do we just write to our MPs, or is there anything happening to make that side better?
Oh, I know there's so many things like that. The pellet industry is another really good example. So it's not the MPs, it's the MLAs, because forests are governed by provincial legislature. And yes, writing to your MLA, writing to David Eby. And that's all really important. And I think that everybody did that, and send your MLA a letter. It does make a difference. At the same time, there's going to take many, many pressures on government to make these changes. And I would say that right now, is that they're on the cusp of change, because, and it's because, climate change is here. People are pressuring. People don't want this anymore. We don't want to be seeing all these resources being, shipped over to the UK or Japan or China. That the forests need to stay here and create jobs here and value added, and it's a disaster to do this, right? It's disastrous for pellets and paper to be shipped into other countries. There's so many stories of this. So pressuring the MLAs is really important. And I work with my Mother Tree Network to try to, and we're talking to assistant deputy ministers on a regular basis of saying, push carbon. We need to, that's one transitional pathway to transition our economy. It's not, and there's always this environment versus jobs argument, but that is kind of fading away. It doesn't really hold water anymore, especially when, you see stuff like this where you create jobs and create carbon or at least grow carbon at the same time. So we have to keep pushing and pushing. And I think that, Fairy Creek was a really good example of people being just fed up. Right, just fed up with this and protesting. and then it's very messy because it becomes a wedge issue for First Nations because they're pitted against Engos, and so we have to really not give up on this, but that those protests play a role. Supporting nations is really, really important. You know, supporting rights and title is really important. Writing to your MLAs, pushing for those changes, getting out and protesting yourself if you want to. Constantly pressuring from all angles. It's not going to take one thing, it's going to take all of those things. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're running out of time, so we have time for just one more question.
Hi, thank you. Hi, I'm Taylor. I'm a second-year forest sciences student at UBC. I have a question about CITES, an international agreement that protects a lot of endangered species. But what's interesting is that large trees like old growth are extremely endangered because there's only like 2 to 3% left here. But what's interesting is that they're not included on the list because it has to do with the species itself. Do you think if there was an international agreement or add-on onto CITES about old growth trees being protected, do you think that might aid something, especially with illegal logging taking more money than even human trafficking, right?
I think that all these agreements raise the profile of what we're doing. They have to have some kind of teeth in them, you know. So there's all these, you know, we really got to clean up these acts and agreements because it's so easy for our government to ignore them. It's so easy to find loopholes. Even our Species at Risk Act, which is a federal act, doesn't protect species in British Columbia because provincially they're not protected. There is no provincial Species at Risk Act right now. And so we need to pressure our governments to clean that up and then put some, you know, penalties on these things. Like there's no penalty for even destroying caribou habitat and, you know, grizzly bear habitat. Like it's like in the legislation, but we're still doing business as usual. So there's got to be multiple ways, and I think that, I mean, I'm not familiar with that particular thing, but I think, you know, every little thing that we can do to make it harder or and hold our governments to account, you know, I'm in agreement with that. That's not a very good answer, but I because I don't know about that specific case, but yeah. There's also a whole movement called Rights of Nature, which I think is really important, is to put, you know, give nature a right, like a human right. Yeah.
Okay, I know there are lots more questions you want to ask, but that's all the time we have, I'm afraid. I'd like to thank Suzanne for a terrific presentation and raising our awareness of the role of life below ground, as well as supporting climate change, in supporting climate change and conservation and biodiversity. Let's give Suzanne another round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Suzanne. I'm got to watch out for this thing, obviously. On behalf of the garden and the Faculty of Science, we'd like to thank you. And I think they're going to want photographs. Yeah, and I'd like to. It's been wonderful that you could share this story and your research with us. And as I say, on behalf of the Faculty of Science and the garden, thank you again. I just suggested she don't try planting that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening as we recognize Peter Wharton's legacy